Hello my lovelies, today let's talk the line of the Noldorian kings. Knowing we're talking about 10,000s of years of elven kings, but our list has only 6 rulers might sound strange. But then, elves are immortal, and if you compare it to the kings of the other 2 elven houses, it's actually quite a lot. Before we start the video, I would like to ask you to leave a like and consider subscribing. I see a lot of you who watch my videos are actually not subscribed to my channel, and it would help me to grow and keep the content coming. Thank you very much. Let's put the line of the Noldor kings in comparison to other royal bloodlines first. The first house of elves, the Valinor, only ever had one true king, Ingwe. After leading his people from Middle-earth, their birthplace, to the undying lands of the gods at the beginning of time, he never returned or looked back. King Ingwe was never involved in any real conflict and wrote his people out of the history of the world and became closer to the gods themselves than concerning himself with the fate of humanity and the world. There was never an uproar against him, and he must have been a wise and good king to his people. Turgon would have told us if this wouldn't have been the case. Also note, Ingwe was de facto the king of kings. He was the high king of all elves, as the Valinor in a way were the OG, or the first house of all elves. That did not mean he ruled in any way over Ñoldor or Teleri, but his standing was above all other elven kings. And standing is not power, keep that in mind, because tucking Noldor rulers, power will play a pivotal part in their right to rule. It won't just be who's next in line. The kingship of the Teleri, the third house of the elves, did split up in the early days, as their first selected king stayed behind in Middle-earth for love, and built and established his kingdom there. That king was Fingon. His younger brother, Olwe, made it further and established a second kingdom of the Teleri elves in the Undying Lands. So there were for a time being 2 kings of the Teleri, but they also were the largest host of the elves. If you want to know more on the 3 houses of elves, I have dedicated videos on them. Obviously, this is the Elven Lore channel, basically. Hopefully linked here in the info box top right of your screen. King Fingon died in the First Age, and his kingdom fell not much later. The Teleri were scattered all over Middle-earth. Till the end of the Third Age, we will have various kingdoms of Teleri elves, Mirkwood under Oropher and later Thranduil amongst them. But there was no real high kingship of the Teleri after Fingon's death, I would say. So now let's talk Ñoldor. Their first king was Finwë. He reigned from the beginning of days of the elves. He must have been amongst the 144 OG elves that were born in Quivenen. Together with a host of his people, he went to the Undying Lands and settled there. Him, Ingwe of the Valinor, and later Olwe of the Teleri, established their realms in the Undying Lands. Their people flourished, and especially the Ñoldor under King Finwë experienced blissful days in the lands of the gods. They learned from their creators themselves, grew in numbers, became wise and knowledgeable lawmasters and skillful smiths and craftsmen, and enriched elven culture. It sounds like a fairy tale, but obviously it's not. Enter Morgoth, the OG Dark Lord, and the reason the bliss of Valinor would soon be over for the elves. Well, at least for the Noldor, under their king and ruler Finwë. But before we talk about the dark days in the land of enlightenment, we need to mention one event that shaped Finwë's rule, giving life to the king's firstborn son. Queen Miriel, also of the Ñoldor, lost her life, or rather gave it up freely. The child and heir to the throne would become the most powerful and gifted elf of all, at least in theory, but that is for another video. And giving life to him, the queen had to give her life. So the king had his heir, but he was without a queen, and as elves marry for life, and they can only die physically, so only their body can die, the king was left with an undead wife that chose not to continue her life in her physical form. For Finwë, that meant he would not have more children, and it would be Fëanor, that was what the child was called, and him from now on. In a way, I understand the king. It was his duty to produce offspring and establish a line. We know that too well from our own history. But elves were immortal, and their realm was in the undying lands, where there was no war, no hardship, nothing that would even lead to him needing multiple heirs to his throne. He most likely would never need an heir to follow him. Or so he thought. Spoiler, his queen wouldn't be the only one dying in the undying lands. After much lamenting to the Valar that the other kings had vast families, he really came up with this argument. He was given permission to remarry, but his queen had to declare to stay in the halls of the dead and never to have a physical form again. In Indis of the Valinor, the daughter or sister or kin, it's not clear in what relation she stands to the king of the Valinor, Finwë found his new queen, and his wish was finally granted. She gave him 4 children, and his line was secured. Let us hear what the Valar Mandos had to say about this union. Behold, Indis the fair shall be made glad and fruitful, who might else have been solitary. For not in death only hath the shadow entered into Aman, with the coming of the children destined to suffer. There are other sorrows, even if they be less. Long she had loved Finwë, in patience and without bitterness. Aule named Fëanor the greatest of the Eldar, and in potency, that is true. But say unto you that the children of Indis shall also be great, and the tale of Arda more glorious because of their coming. And from them shall spring things so fair that no tears shall dim their beauty, in whose being the Valar and the kindreds both of elves and men that are to come shall all have part, and in whose deeds they shall rejoice. So that long hence, when all that here is and seemed yet fair and impregnable shall none the less have faded and passed away, the light of a man shall not wholly cease among the free people of Arda until the end. So, in a way, his selfish wish to remarry because others had more children, and yes, I don't think he married for love, although his second wife did, led to a line of kings that would change the fate of the world. Good kings, wise kings, and just kings. Overall, Finwë was not a bad king, but after his children started quarreling amongst each other, he left the capital and his people to be with his firstborn and heir, who was banished for a time being for inappropriate behavior. A king's first duty is not to his family, but to his people. And this made Finwë not only look bad as a king, a father should also not take one child's side. Yes, he led his people into fall to the undying lands, but the peace did not last, and due to his inability to make wise decisions as a king and father, I can't add Finwë to the list of good kings. His death was not very glorious. Morgoth killed him, stole the Silmarils, killed the 2 holy trees of Valinor, and fled to Middle-earth. The de facto next in line was Finwë's firstborn, Fëanor. There was never a coronation or a declaration of any form, but he was the true leader of the Ñoldor after his father's death. But Finwë's sudden death brought to life what had happened before Fëanor's banishment by the gods. The deep-rooted division of the house of Finwë came to daylight. His younger brothers, Fingolfin and Finarfin, the sons of Indis of the Valinor, had become popular leaders amongst the Ñoldor. None of them ever claimed the title, but Melkor himself seeded that exact doubt in Fëanor's mind. His brothers plotting to overthrow him and rob him of his birthright, the only thing that was left of his parents. He became paranoid, and the brothers and the whole family with them drifted further apart. No one questioned Fëanor's claim to rule. He was the firstborn son of the king, after all. But unwise decisions, anger management problems, and the proclamation to revenge his father's death, and even going against the will of the Valar by doing so, made many Noldor look towards the former king's other sons. Sons that did not speak against the gods and did not demand unchallenged allegiance. But the new king was powerful. He had many followers who did listen to his speeches, who did want to revenge their king's death, and who wanted to leave the lands for their lands of origins. The new king promised them freedom, vast lands of their own without the strict rules of the Valar. A tempting promise for many, and many choose to follow, ignoring the warnings and the foretold doom that was awaiting them. My feelings regarding Fëanor's first days as a king. Just like his father, he put his own personal issues before his people. He must have known he could never truly beat Morgoth. He knew the price they had to pay to leave Middle-earth would be permanent banishment from their home. Not because he was leaving, but rather the way he would leave. Most of the elves that did follow him were born in the Undying Lands. Only a few were OG elves, whose birthland had been Middle-earth. He led them to an unknown world, full of terrors and hardship. A land where the Dark Lord dwelt, and where they would not find many allies. Fëanor knew this, and he still led his people to their doom. It was actually the opposite that his father had done, who led his people to the lands of the gods to live in peace and happiness. His worst hour as a king and leader came when he slew his own kin. The elves of Aqualonde. They had to die for a safe passage. They were denying him after learning he had acted, spoken, and even rebelled against the gods. Those were their ships, and it was their right not to grant him passage over the sea. So he took the ships by force, and he slayed innocent elves by the thousands. By the way, his followers were just as guilty in my eyes. This wasn't a war. They knew full well they were not attacked, but they did attack unarmed elves for ships. By this deed he sealed his fate and those of his people. I told you about the rift amongst the Noldor. Fëanor full well knew more than half of his subjects would rather follow his brothers, Fingolfin in particular, and so he only took those with him that needed no persuasion to follow him. Like a true despot, he felt he didn't need to answer to anyone but himself. He had no time or patience to deal with subjects that would question his decision as a king. So, a few days into his kingship, he already had lost more than half of his subjects. Some to his brothers, and some did choose to fully stay behind in the Undying Lands. The oath of his brothers to accept him as a king and to follow his lead blindly meant nothing to him, and he knew it wouldn't last. Fingolfin and Finarfin were not capable of imagining the lengths he was willing to go to reclaim his precious jewels. Because one might argue he was defending the honor of his father in going after Morgoth and taking his followers with him. But this was mostly not about his father, but the objects he created and was not willing to let go. Not even if it meant death and destruction to his people and even his own children. He was blinded by his hate and anger and his pride, and that was what finally led to his early death. Because, spoiler, he didn't last long as a king of the Noldor. He died battling Balrogs. He never even got close to the Silmarils or anywhere close to defeating Morgoth or even revenging his father's death. Yes, the Noldor coming to Middle-earth was important to the later story. Without Fëanor demanding his people and his family to follow him blindly, Morgoth would never have fallen, and good would never have triumphed over evil. But at what cost? He literally was the worst king that ever ruled. Never did he put his people first. It was always about him. In a world where Morgoth was the worst example of a demigod, Fëanor was the worst example of a king. I'm sure he would have hated to be in the same category as his biggest foe, but maybe he himself was his biggest foe all along. You would now think the logical next in line would be Fëanor's eldest son. He had 7 of them, by the way, but this was not the case and the bloodline was broken. Well, not fully. Wanting to heal the rift his father had caused amongst all Ñoldor, Medros relinquished the kingship and passed it on to his uncle. In my opinion, there were 3 main reasons for that. Fëanor's eldest son and heir knew standing alone against Morgoth would never work. Fingolfin's host and the host of the children of Finarfin who went with him were the greater host and seemingly more powerful. He saw the errors his father had made and knew they were unforgivable, but also he knew everything he would do would fall under the doom that was foretold by the gods. And third, Fingolfin's eldest son Fingon saved him from dying, and his gratefulness for that selfless deed even proved more the line of Fingolfin were worthy and succeeding Fëanor. Not that that would have taken much. If there lay no grievance between us, Lord, still the kingship would rightly come to you, the eldest heir of the house of Finwë, and not the least wise. So Medros gave up his birthright and also gave away the right to rule for all his 6 brothers. Much to their annoyance, as you can imagine, not all of the 7 brothers were as foresighted and diplomatic as the eldest. In a way, it makes you wonder if Medros would have been a good and wise king. I do think so. Tolkien especially mentions him when talking about no one but him having regrets of burning the ships and forcing Fingolfin's host to cross the Helcaraxe, and most likely die in doing so. But just as the doom foretold, all their endeavors would lead to nothing and in the end, in catastrophe and death. And because Medros did fall under that doom, his kingship would have been doomed, no matter if he would have had the potential to be a good and just king. He had his father to thank for that. So the kingship was passed to the line of the second-born son to Finwë, Fingolfin. In my eyes, the best king any else would ever have. His reign lasted for around 450 solar years. Not long, but long enough to heal some of the wounds the rift of the brothers had caused. Fingolfin ruled from Hithlum and was the first High King of the Noldor that just ruled from Middle-earth. For 400 years he brought relative peace to Middle-earth as he besieged Angband and Morgoth went into hiding. The elves did flourish during those years and established many realms all over Middle-earth. The Dagor Bragolach ended all hopes of peace in Middle-earth, and Morgoth brought death and destruction of the elven realms, releasing the Uroloki, fire-spying monsters that elves were not aware of. Angrod and Egnor, his brother's sons, died in this battle amongst thousands of his people. The king knew this could lead to their complete and utter defeat and destruction, and to bring an end to death and destruction he made a fatal decision. He challenged the Dark Lord himself to single combat, and Morgoth came. The fight must have been one of the greatest fights in fantasy literature, if you ask me. And yes, the king lost the battle and paid with his life in the end. He knew this would happen mounting his horse, but he rode to battle anyway. And now you might ask, how wise was that? He was the king after all, and he knew his people would lose their leader. But did he have another choice? His courage ended the war and saved many lives. He wounded the Dark Lord himself and showed the world Morgoth was not undefeatable, and he knew the line of kings was secure through his sons. I also want to mention he was not only brave and wise and a just king, he also, even before becoming a king, himself knew the rule of kingship. He saw an oath to his brother, his king, and followed him, even though his brother had belittled him, and Fëanor himself never had shown any loyalty to Fingolfin or his family. Fingolfin always had stayed loyal to his king, though. The next in line and the fourth ruling king of the Noldor was Fingolfin's eldest son, Fingon. Fingon had been close to some of the sons of Fëanor and therefore was another perfect choice to unite the houses of Finwë again. Sadly, his rule was the shortest one of all. He ruled from 456 First Age till 472. 16 years is nothing in the lifespan of an elf. We don't know much about his time as ruler. Fingon embodied many qualities his father had shown. I guess during the main part of his short-lived reign, he was busy with reconstructing the elven realms and recover from the heavy losses. In 462 First Age, Morgoth attacked Fingon and Hithlum directly, and the new king was saved by the Teleri of the Falas under their lord Círdan. Another sign, the old wounds of the Ñoldor attacking the Teleri centuries ago had begun to heal under the new kingship. Another war was coming, the Nirnaeth Anodiad, and this would be the last battle the king would fight. Betrayed by men and some allies, the king died dueling two Balrogs. He was slain by the lord of Balrogs himself, Gothmog. The line of Fingolfin wouldn't end with the death of Fingon, though. The king had no offspring, and therefore the crown passed to his younger brother, Fingolfin's second son, Turgon, king of Gondolin. I wouldn't say Turgon ever was a true high king of all Ñoldor, though. He definitely was never crowned or called himself anything else but king of Gondolin. He reigned in and from the hidden city and did not truly interact with the other Noldor realms. His reign was also a short-lived one. After the passing of his brother in 472 First Age, he ruled over was rather titled as the High King for 28 years till the year 510. The hidden city, due to treachery from his own nephew Meglin, did fall in a gruesome secret attack of Morgoth, who also knew the king of Gondolin and his house would actually his biggest foes. This was due to a prophecy that his fall would come from the line of Turgon, and the prophecy did come true. But the king had to die, and most of Gondolindrim with him. What we know of Turgon as a king most likely stems from his time of ruling over Gondolin. He was a good leader, and like his father and brother, always put his people and their safety first. But a day came when he became too sure of the strength of his house and the safety of his walls, and he had become arrogant and did not listen to the warnings of the Valar. That doesn't make him a bad king. Till the end, he did fight for his people and his city and gave his life for them. After him, it wasn't his daughter Idril or her young son following. I'm not sure Tolkien ever considered a queen ruling over all Noldor. The crown passed to the house of Finarfin, and the only male heir alive in Middle-earth at that time, Ereinion Gil-galad. Finrod, Angrod and Agnor, Finarfin's sons, were all dead. Galadriel was the only child of Finarfin that was still alive. But Angrod had a son, Orodreth, who himself had two children, Finduilas and Ereinion Gil-galad. The new High King of all Noldor would also be their last one. His reign was the longest of any of the High Kings that ruled from Middle-earth. But to be fair, the times would also become less chaotic and more peaceful in the Second Age. The First Age was over, and the OG Dark Lord Morgoth was captured, and it would take some time till his former student Sauron would take full control over Middle-earth and become the new Dark Lord. Gil-galad was the perfect ruler and king for the times to come. His foresight that the elves were diminishing and their prime days were over made him find powerful allies in the Númenóreans, the new powerhouse of the Second Age, and the perfect ally to complete full coverage of Middle-earth against the rising evil in the east that would be revealed as Sauron himself. Gil-galad wasn't too proud to ask the Númenóreans for help and accept them as equals in any way. In Aldarion and some of the later kings, he found what he was looking for: kings and their armies to aid Middle-earth fighting the good fight, side by side. After the destruction of Beleriand at the end of the First Age, Gil-galad had founded a new kingdom, Lyndon. Linden became the new realm of most of the Noldor left in Middle-earth, and also the refuge of other elven tribes. He proved to be not only a foresighted and wise ruler, but was also successful in battles, fighting off Sauron's various attacks throughout the Second Age. His closeness to the Lord of the Elves of the Falas, Círdan, who in a way acted as his stepfather again, showed the old wounds of the Teleri and the Ñoldor had healed over centuries, and the good kings of the Ñoldor that had ruled for centuries now. Gil-galad was amongst those who never trusted Anatar, aka Sauron, and never welcomed him in Linden. He later was given the elven ring Vilja, which had passed to Elrond to strengthen his position in the newfound Rivendell. The strong alliance with Elrond and the elves under Círdan's rule, together with the Númenóreans, were what made Gil-galad and his kingship last for centuries. But Sauron had become too powerful, and the elves of the Second Age, and especially the Ñoldor, were not the Ñoldor of the First Age. Most of the great warriors and kings and leaders of those days were dead. The end of the line of the kings came with Gil-galad's death in the Battle of the War of the Last Alliance. He died fighting the Dark Lord himself. He died a hero of the Ñoldor, but the line ended with him. He did not have any offspring, and no one claimed the title. Elrond, being a descendant of Fingolfin, could have. Turgon was his great-grandfather. He definitely could have claimed the kingship. Maybe even Galadriel could have claimed the crown. None of them did. I think they saw the days of the kings of the Ñoldor were over, and their power wouldn't be enough to protect Middle-earth. One thing I want to mention though, Finarfin never left the Undying Lands and most likely acted as the king of the Noldor in Valinor. So when the ban finally was lifted and the Noldor could return to the lands of the gods and reunite with their ancestors, they had a king again, Finarfin the Wise. And that, my lovelies, was the line of the Noldor kings. Who was your favorite out of the line of the kings? I think it's pretty clear who mine is. Leave a comment. I always love to read your thoughts and suggestions. I hope you enjoyed this one, my lovelies. Till the next one. Bye bye.